When I was in grade 11 and 12, I got pretty decent grades. I really locked in because those are the important years that post-secondary schools are going to look at your grades from. Before that, though, I really didn't try that hard in school, and Social Studies 10 was no exception to that. However, it was made worse in that class for a few reasons. One of them being that I wasn't really all that interested in war or history, so all the small details we had to memorize just got lost in translation. But more importantly, in this class, the only thing we did that contributed to our marks was tests. With projects like presentations, posters, or even abstract questions, it allowed me to engage and get my creative juices flowing. And if you mix the creative and academic parts of my brain, I'm suddenly given a fighting chance. Now, at this point in my life, I was especially bad at test taking because I hadn't taken the time to learn how to study properly, which meant that instead of doing what I did in later grades, like drawing things out and making flashcards, I just read the notes we were provided a few times and called it good. Yes, you heard that right, I didn't even take my own notes. And on top of that, I barely paid attention in class because the teacher would spend the entire hour and a half lecturing, which was too much for me to take in at one time. Let's just call my teacher Miss Phillips. My school would also add 40 minutes onto the first class of the day for studying that was supposed to be student-directed, meaning we could do what we wanted, but Miss Phillips would lecture through that time more often than not. But I'll give her the benefit of the doubt considering the sheer amount of material she had to teach throughout one semester. So, as you may be able to imagine, by the time the course was coming to an end, my grade was not looking so hot. But my saving grace and the light at the end of the tunnel was my final exam. One option for our final exam was a poster or slideshow where we would do research and write about social sciences, which is perfect for me because it meant I got to make something and it forced me to use my time wisely instead of reading over the notes a few times and calling it a day. If only it were that simple. But the other option was a final exam on everything we had learned in that class. And it was a class vote. But luckily for me, the class almost unanimously voted for the visual presentation. Miss Phillips seemed pretty disappointed about that though, so she gave the option to take the exam anyway, which I obviously didn't opt for. Now, this was supposed to be a partner project, and I had sort of become friends with the girl sitting next to me. We'll name her Julie. But Miss Phillips said that if we really wanted to, we could do it alone, but it would still be the same amount of work. So one day Julie asked me, "Are you going to do the project alone or with a partner?" And I wanted to do it with her, but I didn't know how to ask, so I just said, I'm not sure. Yeah, I was thinking I would probably do it alone. Group projects are such a hassle, it's easier to do it yourself sometimes. And that pretty much settled it for me. So when we started getting work blocks for our final, I was reading over the topic options, and there were a bunch of categories with subcategories beneath them. And I thought that we had to cover all the subcategories for our topic. But when I was already almost finished the project, Julie said to me, "Oh, you're doing all the types of overconsumption? Yeah, don't we have to?" "No, nobody else is. I'm just doing fast fashion for mine." Well, dang it. So not only is my presentation way longer than it should be, I also don't go very in-depth into anything I talk about. Another thing we had to do for the project was formally cite all of our sources so the teacher could see where we got our information. And on top of giving credit to the websites, we also had to cite every image we used. But I really didn't like writing citations, and I didn't want to cite all the images on top of all the websites I used, so I decided I was going to draw all the pictures for my slideshow. But back then, I had never done any kind of digital art before, and I quickly realized it was going to take a lot longer than I had anticipated. So I started sketching every drawing out on a piece of paper, then finelining them, scanning them onto my phone, and finally importing them into a drawing app just to use the paint bucket tool. Then I would just screenshot that and add it into the presentation. I made that way more difficult than it needed to be, especially considering most people chose slideshows because if you did a poster, it was mandatory to hand draw everything. The whole point of doing a slideshow was supposed to be that you didn't have to draw. But nevertheless, I submitted my final in all its glory and was set free into summer break. I was really just hoping for a high B, which would pull my overall grade up to a low B with a bit of pity from my teacher. Until I got a message from Miss Phillips. "Hi Sophie, did you do the project with a partner or by yourself? And where did you get the graphics?" "Hi Miss Phillips, I did the project alone and I made all the graphics myself." "It's exceptional, Sophie. I thought perhaps the graphics were hand-drawn and I'm impressed by them. You know, the original drawing aspect was for the posters. Slideshows could be downloaded, as long as the images are relevant and informative to the specific topics, and yours are. In fact, the hand-drawing is quite engaging and impressive. Would it be alright if I used it as an example in future classes?" Needless to say, I was very surprised, especially when she gave me extra credit on the project for making all the artwork. The highest you were supposed to be able to get was a 12 out of 12, and she gave me a 13 out of 12. Which pulled my grade in the class up to a B, even though I'm pretty sure I got a C on like every test we did, if not lower. So in the end, the project I considered to be a garbage fire ended up saving my grade, because I can all but guarantee I would have failed that class if the final was a written exam. Moral of the story, I never studied for that class and I didn't learn my lesson. Until Pre-Calc 10 came around, but that's a story for another day.